The priority for the new Prime Minister will be the cost of living crisis. The Foreign Secretary is reportedly considering a freeze on energy bills. The Shadow Justice Secretary, Steve Reed, told us that neither candidate is the fresh start that the country needs.
There really are two peas in a pod, both of them senior members in the government. Liz Truss, actually the longest-serving member of the cabinet, who voted for all the things that she spent the last few weeks trying to distance herself from, including all 15 of Boris Johnson's tax hikes. Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, they're not the fresh start that this country needs. For that, we need a general election and the election of a Labour government, because either of these will simply be more of the same.
Well, the new Prime Minister will formally be appointed by the Queen at Balmoral tomorrow. We'll have full coverage of the contest here, of course, for you on GB News from midday. In other news now, police in Canada are hunting for two men suspected of killing 10 people in a wave of stabbings in the province of Saskatchewan. The suspects, named as Damien and Miles Sanderson, are accused of launching attacks across 13 crime scenes. At least 15 other people were injured. Police say it appears some victims were targeted, others were stabbed at random. A High Court challenge against the government's plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda is being heard this morning. The first flight was due to leave in June, but it was grounded following a series of legal challenges. The Home Secretary had signed an agreement with the country in April in a move designed to deter migrants from crossing the Channel. The Home Office says Rwanda is fundamentally safe and a secure country with a track record of supporting asylum seekers. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now let's go back to Tom.
A very good morning to you, live from Downing Street. This is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your television and your radio. Well, today is the last day that Boris Johnson is Prime Minister. Tomorrow, of course, he flies to Balmoral, and in the morning he will hand over the reins to the next winner, the winner of the Tory leadership contest. I was about to say hand over the reins to Liz Truss, and while that's overwhelmingly likely, that's not official until 12:30 this afternoon. Full coverage, of course, here on GB News. But today on The Briefing, we're looking back over the last 3 years of Boris Johnson's premiership. Just how did he do? What were the highs? What were the lows? And could it have gone any differently? I'm delighted to be joined first this morning by Lord Moyland. Lord Moyland was an advisor to Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London, now of course sits as a peer in the House of Lords, a Conservative peer. Lord Moyland, I suppose first of all, you worked with Boris Johnson as Mayor of London. He managed 8 years in that role, and yet only 3 as Prime Minister. What's the difference?
Well, part of the difference is constitutional, of course. He was elected with a personal mandate to be Mayor of London in 2008 and re-elected by a majority of Londoners in 2012. So he couldn't be removed until another election came along if he hadn't stood in it, if he'd stood in it. Whereas, of course, in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister is the person who commands the confidence of the House, much more dependent on the shifting moods, the anxieties, the fears of members of Parliament, and that was the difference, really, in constitutional terms.
And it's so interesting looking at how Boris Johnson's premiership started. At first, people were thinking it could be one of the shortest in history, when we were seeing the Conservative Party in 4th place in some polls over that summer. But very quickly, he was able to consolidate the half of the electorate that were backing the Conservative Party and the Brexit Party, calling that general election and delivering that largest parliamentary majority for the Conservative Party since Margaret Thatcher, since 1987. It all looked like it was going rather swimmingly at the start. There was the famous Greenwich speech where he laid out this big plan for reform of the country and levelling up and everything else. And then COVID came along. I wonder if it was COVID and that global pandemic that really derailed fundamentally his premiership.
Well, I heard Boris say once in a meeting that the history of pandemics is the history of solidarity followed by anger. So I think the issue of the effect of COVID on this country is going to be with us for a very long time, both in terms of the public mood and clearly, as we see today, in terms of its effects on the economy. It's not the only thing affecting the economy. We have Russia's illegal war in Ukraine to add to that. But the effects on the economy and the debt that was incurred and those things, I mean, possibly we couldn't have avoided it, but the effects will be here a long time. But also, I think, on the public mood. And I think, you know, when we lifted the lockdown, or the government lifted the lockdowns and we went back to normal, we didn't really go back to normal. There's a psychological effect of that trauma of the pandemic, which we haven't really got over yet. And I think that contributed in some ways to the anger that the government began to experience.
I think it might have been Anthony Eden who once said, "Events, dear boy, events." When assessing how well a Prime Minister does, you can never account for events. And clearly it was 9/11 and the subsequent Iraq war that became the issue that defined Tony Blair's premiership. It was the financial crisis that became the issue that defined the premiership of Gordon Brown. And to some extent it was Brexit that defined the premiership of David Cameron, at least towards the end, and Theresa May. COVID will certainly define the premiership of Boris Johnson. But I suppose it's how a Prime Minister rises to the events that are thrown at them that is the mark of that Prime Minister. Boris Johnson came under a lot of criticism for slow reaction and sometimes what was described as confused reaction to the COVID pandemic, saying that he wouldn't want to lock down and then locking down, almost pleasing no one in that way of governing that Dominic Cummings described as like a shopping trolley, crashing from aisle to aisle without a clear sense of purpose. Do you think that's a fair description?
Well, I think it's the reverse, actually. I think the fact is that very few other people could have seen us through the pandemic through the lockdowns, in a relatively united way. The fact that Boris Johnson was so obviously reluctant to impose a lockdown with all the damage it was likely to do, which we now see more and more of, I think actually encouraged people to think that actually he was on their side. And I think a Prime Minister who'd rushed in like some of the Secretaries of State around Boris might have done, locked everyone down and obviously enjoyed and relished the whole thing, and then locked harder, would have created a great deal more division. I think Boris actually helped us see us through. But I think there's more than that. I think the defining event of Boris's term is actually the delivery of Brexit. And I think that has been the most transformative thing that a Prime Minister has done since Mrs. Thatcher. It needs completion in respect of Northern Ireland. I think he'd have got round to that. Now it falls to Liz Truss to do it. And the other thing that will define him is the fact that he has been leading Europe in the war, in the response to Russia's illegal war. We've seen Germany and France and Italy all over the shop, not knowing what they're doing, what they're meant to be doing. But in the case of Boris, there's been clear leadership and solid support for Ukraine, which many European countries have rallied round and been glad of the leadership.
Yes, whilst it might have been issues surrounding COVID, or indeed the behaviour of people in the building behind me during the COVID pandemic that brought around the atmosphere that brought Boris Johnson down, it would be completely remiss of us to point to the many successes of his premiership. And I think we should dwell on some of those, because not least of all, defeating Jeremy Corbyn and fundamentally changing the Labour Party, much in the way that Margaret Thatcher changed the Labour Party in her 3 general election victories, in her 3 landslides. Boris Johnson changed the Labour Party in his 1 landslide, going from the sort of crank left leadership that we saw under Jeremy Corbyn. I can't imagine what the Labour Party would be saying about the crisis in Ukraine, for example, were Jeremy Corbyn still leader of that party. Perhaps under-remarked of the last 3 years is how Boris Johnson has not only changed the Tory party, but the entire landscape of British electoral politics.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think the Labour Party has actually changed that much. It's true that the extreme leftists, the Corbynites, are not in charge anymore, but I still think it's the case that the leader of the great campaign in Parliament to overturn Brexit through having a bogus second referendum, Keir Starmer is still leading the Labour Party. And although he says he's changed his spots, I'm very dubious about that. I think he's using that remark, that idea of changing his spots, in order to cover ever closer alignment with the European Union that would allow us one day, maybe in the distant future, to go back in, but certainly to stay under their laws in the meantime. So there have been changes. I think Labour had to change because they thought the public were on their side over Brexit up until December 2019, and they discovered with a resounding crash that the public was not on their side and they preferred Boris. That victory of Boris, that huge victory, is testament to his own personal rapport with the public, and that is something that has been of huge value to the Conservative Party, and it's given lots of MPs their seats, and now they've got to try and manage without.
And we've mentioned some of those successes of the last few years, getting Britain finally out of the European Union, having a zero tariff, zero quota free trade agreement with that economic power on our doorstep. But also, of course, the vaccine rollout, the fastest in Europe, one of the best in the world, and no doubt, of course, the leadership that Boris Johnson has shown in Ukraine. I suppose looking forward, might it be tempting for Boris Johnson, someone who is seen as one of the most popular international figures now in Ukraine, someone who's visited Kiev 3 times in the last few months, who has had roads named after him, indeed pastries named after him in Ukraine, and received the highest civilian honour that is possible to be given in that country too? Might we be thinking that Boris Johnson might be tempted to take up some sort of role with regards to Ukraine in the months and years ahead?
I have absolutely no idea what role you might be envisaging, and I'm not going to speculate on Boris's future. I'll just say that he's still a relatively young, vigorous, intellectually engaged, very popular politician, and I'm sure if the country wants him to serve in any role, be it in Ukraine or anywhere else, that he will give very serious thought to it.
Yes, whilst the premiership of Boris Johnson may be over, the leadership of the Conservative Party over at lunchtime today, the premiership over tomorrow morning, I very much doubt it will be the last that we hear of Boris Johnson in British electoral politics. No doubt he'll be a very significant voice for the months and years to come. For now, Lord Moylan, thank you so much for talking through the last few years of the Boris Johnson premiership with us this morning on The Briefing. Well, let's turn now to Tim Montgomery. Tim is a senior GBNews contributor. He's the founder of the co-founder of the Conservative Home website and the Centre for Social Justice. Briefly served as an advisor to Boris Johnson as well in Downing Street. And Tim, I wonder, for you, what is the biggest takeaway of the 3 years of Boris Johnson in Downing Street?
I think you have to give him credit for 2 big things, Tom. One really was rescuing the party from the horrors of the 2016 to 2019 period, when the Parliament was in a complete quagmire over Brexit. The Tory party, if you remember, came even behind the Green Party in the European elections of that year. And he took the Conservative Party from that absolutely devastating position to win a majority of 80. He therefore got Brexit over the line, and he defeated Jeremy Corbyn. That, if you like, was his high point, that massive majority. But then, with that majority, he failed really to achieve any significant reforms during the period he was in power. No house building, no simplification of the tax system, no control of immigration, really. So a very disappointing record, given he won that huge majority.
It's interesting remembering Boris Johnson's 2019 pitch for the leadership of the Conservative Party. He used an acronym. DUDE, he said. Deliver Brexit, unite the country, defeat Corbyn and then energise the country. He used to say that actually it was just the first three, but he added the E because it was an unfortunate acronym, DUD, that he didn't want to be saying. And I wonder actually if we look back at his record on each of those 4 points, D-U-D-E, he seems to have certainly delivered Brexit, certainly defeated Jeremy Corbyn, to a large extent united the Conservative Party, which before he became Prime Minister was seeing defectors from it to other parties, etc. It seems more united now than it was certainly 3 years ago. But when it comes to energising the country, the 4th point of that acronym, perhaps it hasn't been entirely completed.
Yeah, I think I've made sort of push back a little bit, Tom, on the idea that he's united the Conservative Party as well. I think he failed really when he sacked. Remember those MPs who were resisting making Brexit happen? He expelled a lot of Conservative MPs, big heavyweights, including Ken Clarke from the party. I thought that was the right decision at the time because they were obstructing the will of the people in opposing the referendum result. But after winning that 2019 general election, he really should have brought the party back together and brought some of the big beasts back in. And instead, he really kept the cabinet largely of Brexiteers. They weren't the most talented people necessarily in the party. I think he has always really failed to reach out to other members of the party to really re-establish the big church that is when the Conservative Party is at its strongest. But yes, you're absolutely right. Fundamentally, the man who was always good at giving people hope, giving people the sense of achievement, he was a believer in Britain. He has failed to energise the country. He's failed to deliver the long-term reforms that will mean that could have meant that Britain was looking forward to a much more competitive era.
To some extent, that might be what tipped his premiership off its mortal coil a touch too soon, many people would argue. The idea that this was a big majority, a big opportunity, and relatively little was being done legislatively, at least. It's interesting, though, looking at the commanding leads that Liz Truss now has, expected to become leader of the Conservative Party at lunchtime today. To some extent, it was reported Liz Truss was being seen as the natural successor to Boris Johnson. Certainly some suggestions that Boris Johnson was not publicly, but perhaps secretly, backing her to win. Could she be the kind of leader that has that bold and optimistic sense to deliver those big, long-term structural reforms to the country, supply-side reforms to the country, that Boris Johnson didn't manage to do?
I think she certainly could be, Tom, if she was starting at the beginning of a parliament. The tradition, for all sorts of good reasons, is that when a new prime minister is elected, they get the tough stuff done early. Because if, for example, you're going to build houses in an area where local people resist them, if you build them early enough, at least you have the benefit, 3 or 4 years hence, of new people moving into those homes and being grateful for those new homes. You don't just have the people who are like, should pejoratively call them the NIMBYs, who resisted those things. That's the general pattern of reforms. So if Liz Truss wanted to do big things now, she wouldn't necessarily get the benefits of them by the time of the next general election, which for me suggests that once she's announced her energy package and sort of tried to address the short-term difficulties, not just facing households, but facing the NHS. I think the NHS is the under-discussed story in British politics at the moment. Once she's done those big sort of offers to reassure people, I think she'll go to the country quite quickly, because otherwise she'll be sat as sort of a lame duck prime minister, unable really to get big reforms through Parliament. And I think she'll need a mandate of her own very quickly.
That's a bold prediction. I suppose many Conservative MPs would be shuddering at the prospect of another election in any short order. I heard one rumour that there was a discussion in terms of how long could this Parliament be stretched on for. I suppose it will all depend on what the polls are saying, but theoretically the next general election could be in the early months of 2025, because all that matters is that Parliament is dissolved 5 years after it was formed. You could then have a long election campaign, a prorogued period, slightly over the 5-year point. I wonder if that's another consideration as well. But fundamentally, a strength of the British system, of those up to 5-year terms of parliaments, is, as you say, you can get the big stuff done early. It might settle in by the end. Do you think, therefore, that the short amount of time that there is left to run in this parliament, less than half of this parliament to go, does that mean that Liz Truss won't try any of those big reforms before an election is coming along?
Well, I think she'll announce her intention to do big things, such as build nuclear power stations, one of Boris Johnson's last announcements, connect Manchester and Leeds across the Pennines, perhaps begin to switch funding from university to vocational education. Those are the big things that people in the Red Wall, people who voted for Brexit, wanted. They didn't just want to leave the European Union. They wanted a whole different kind of state in Britain. I think she can announce her intention to do those sorts of bold things should she win a majority. But I don't think she'll be able to do them in the time that's left. And you say, Tom, that I make a bold prediction, and perhaps I have. But I think she could enjoy a honeymoon if her first impression with voters is bold action on the energy crisis. But I don't think she'll want to sit in Downing Street unable to do very much else for very long. That honeymoon effect will wear off. I think it will be better for her to go to the country relatively quickly and say, this is what I want to get done. We're in the middle of a crisis. Give me the mandate to make it happen. Otherwise, I just think she'll be sat in Downing Street with problems mounting, and she'll be unable to take the reforms that would be ideal, simply because those reforms are difficult to engineer at the end of a parliament, the reasons we've both been discussing.
Yes, it'll be a tricky prospect in any general election after the Conservative Party has rattled through 4 prime ministers in just 6 years. I wonder to what extent the British public will think that that's stability. Being asked to vote early might not be the best prospect in terms of, we saw what happened to Theresa May in that regard. But I wonder, looking to the future, looking to a likely Liz Truss premiership starting tomorrow, looking to the activity that will be going on the street behind me tomorrow afternoon, the new cabinet appointments that we are expecting to be made relatively quickly upon her becoming Prime Minister. What's your assessment, Tim Montgomery, of who will make up that top team and how united the cabinet and the direction of the government will be?
I think if the newspaper speculation is right, Tom, and sort of speculation we've seen on GBNews over recent days is also correct, it will be a cabinet of some of Liz Truss's closest allies. And so that suggests that the cabinet itself will be very united. And that's something Liz Truss clearly prizes. It's something that Boris Johnson clearly prized as well. Having an inner team of loyalists to ensure that there wasn't constant briefing from that cabinet and that the government's direction wasn't being challenged from within. But of course, having a government of your closest allies may have one advantage of that kind, but where will the Sunakites go? Where will the people from back Remain who have been less supportive of Boris Johnson's period in office go? You know, there was speculation that people like Jeremy Hunt would be involved in the cabinet. I'm not sure whether that's going to happen. The danger for her, and this was certainly what I was getting on WhatsApp groups I'm part of, I don't know whether you were getting the same yesterday, Tom, was that people who'd seen the Sunday newspaper speculation and were seeing that actually there wasn't much reaching out to Sunak supporters in the draft cabinet list were saying this is hardly a government of all the talent and isn't likely to hasten the reunification of the Conservative Party. So I think she's taking quite a gamble if the cabinet that she begins to announce tomorrow does look like the cabinets as described in the press.
Yes, there's always that risk between what do you do? Do you try and unite the party in having a cabinet with lots of people who think lots of different things and then make it harder to deliver decisions? Or do you have a cabinet of people from one section of the party only, make those decisions very easily, but then have a parliamentary party on the back benches who don't agree so much? A very tricky line to walk. I wonder, though, just finally, the relationship between number 10 and number 11 is is something that has broken down under Boris Johnson and did break down under Theresa May as well. With Kwasi Kwarteng as the likely Chancellor for Liz Truss, these two are very, very close allies. It's going to be likely a better working relationship between the two front doors behind me.
Absolutely, and it's vital. And talking to people inside the Truss campaign, they have been worried about the weakness of sterling on international markets recently. We had an article by Kwasi Kwarteng in the Financial Times today, which I think was an attempt to reassure the people who read the pink newspaper. And I actually thought the announcement that she made yesterday to Laura Kuenssberg on the BBC, that after all she wouldn't be tampering at all with the Bank of England mandate, that to me was perhaps the most significant thing in that interview. They're aware that if they do deliver the tax cuts that they've promised, there could be worry in the financial markets that Britain was letting borrowing out of control. So sending the message that the Bank of England would be able to be as hawkish as it needed to be on inflation, I think that was a big reassurance to markets that this government was actually as serious about inflation as the circumstances demand that it be.
Really, really serious stuff there. It'll be a big, big week ahead. But for now, Tim Montgomery, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning. That's it for the show. Coming up next is Alistair Stewart with a special looking ahead to that announcement of the next Conservative Party leader. Stay with us here on GB News.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking unsettled with some heavy rain in places, but it will be feeling warm. Let's take a look at the details. The southwest of England will start the afternoon largely dry with some sunshine. However, a scattering of heavy showers will begin to develop with the possibility of some hail and thunder in places. Southeast England and East Anglia may also see a few showers, but they'll be more hit and miss here with some hazy spells of sunshine for many. Showers may also affect southern parts of Wales, but further north should be largely dry with some good spells of sunshine. The Midlands should also be largely dry with a mix of cloud and sunshine. The odd shower can't be ruled out though, but in the sunshine it will be feeling warm. It'll be pretty similar across northern England with many areas dry, but a few showers will pop up, especially across Cumbria and Northumberland. Temperatures at lunchtime will be around the low 20s. The morning rain across Scotland will still be lying across the northern half of the country this lunchtime, but further south should be turning brighter with a few showers developing. The best of the dry and bright weather through, though, will be across Northern Ireland with very little cloud in the sky here. It'll be feeling rather warm with temperatures in the high teens. So heading towards the evening, we'll see further heavy showers developing, especially in the south. And that's how your weather is shaping up for the rest of your Monday.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel, Britain's
news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Good morning, this is GB News with me, Alastair Stewart. Do not adjust your sets. It isn't Saturday or Sunday. I will be with you for the next few hours, building up to the announcement of the winner of the Conservative Party leadership race and, of course, the announcement of who will be Britain's next Prime Minister. Do make sure that you get in touch with your views, as usual, on GB Views at gbnews.uk or via GB News social media. I'll be getting to those throughout the show. But first, let's bring you right up to date with the very latest news. Here's Rosie.
Thanks, Alistair. A very good morning. It's 1 minute past 10. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. The country's new Prime Minister and the winner of the Conservative Party leadership contest will be announced today at lunchtime. After weeks of campaigning, Liz Truss, who's widely tipped to win the vote, and Rishi Sunak will finally learn who will be given the keys to number 10. Well, the priority for the new Prime Minister will be the cost of living crisis. The Foreign Secretary is reportedly considering a freeze on energy bills. MP Mark Harper has been backing Rishi Sunak, but says the party should support whoever wins.
I want the parliamentary party to come behind Liz if she wins today. You know, I'm sure she'll be very conscious of the fact that in the MP rounds of this contest, she got about a third of Conservative MPs supporting her. So she'll be wanting to get Conservative MPs behind her so that as she deals with difficult issues this winter, you know, and that she's not going to get much of a gap. It's going to have to be announcing that energy package very soon, that people can unite behind her. And it's a team process.